In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Welcome back. Here we are with part 2 of our interview with science fiction writer and futurist Robert J. Sawyer. Robert has been interviewed over 350 times on radio, over 350 times on television, and countless times in print. He is one of only 8 writers to ever win all 3 of the science fiction field's top awards for the best novel of the year. The Hugo, which he won in 2003 for Hominids, the Nebula, which he won in 1996 for The Terminal Experiment, and the John W. Campbell Memorial Award, which he won in 2006 for Mind Scan. In 2014, Robert was one of the initial inductees in the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. And in 2016, he was a member of the Order of Canada, the highest honor bestowed by the Canadian government. According to the Locus Index to Science Fiction Awards, Robert J. Sawyer has won more awards as a science fiction or fantasy novelist than anyone else in the history of those genres. His newest novel, The Oppenheimer Alternative, was released on June 2nd. You can get it at any bookstore, at Amazon, or on places like audible.com. I advise you strongly to check it out. And now, part 2 of our interview with Robert J. Sawyer. If, like you mentioned, in the digital world in quantum computing, there's all these possibilities, there's all these probabilities, and then whatever you observe is the door you go through, right? So do you see, in terms of quantum, and if you're a believer in it, do you believe in alternate realities and different versions of us out in the universe?
So I think we are still a long way from being done with physics. Just as Isaac Newton thought, done, finished, I've figured it all out. Well, he was wrong, and we're probably wrong too. But based on what we think the nature of physical reality is, which is that everything that can go multiple ways does go multiple ways, but each different version spawns a new separate timeline. Yes, I do think there are a bunch of Robert Sawyers out there, a bunch of you, a bunch of everybody out there, each subtly different, as of the split second in which they deviated from where we are. But by tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, very, very different, completely different lives, unrecognizably different lives in most cases.
Have you ever thought about doing a book? I know you've written a lot of books about that combine science fiction and kind of cross over into mystery, and I want to ask you in a minute what some of your favorites are. Have you ever thought about doing a book, or have you done a book that combines science fiction with the paranormal?
It depends on how you define the paranormal. For instance, I did a book called The Terminal Experiment, which won the Hugo Award for Best Novel of the Year. And it was about a scientific, a biomedical engineer, as a matter of fact, who discovers scientific proof of the existence of the human soul, of the afterlife. I haven't done anything about ghosts. I haven't done anything about poltergeists or anything like that. But if you talk about, as the paranormal, those existential questions of, do we exist after death? Is there a creator? I've dealt with that in a novel called Calculating God. So I would say paranormal isn't my favorite word. Metaphysical is a word that I like a great deal. I've done an awful lot of metaphysical science fiction.
Could you just define metaphysical for our audience real quickly?
Well, the funny thing is, of course, that it dates way back to when, oh my God, I'm having a brain lapse here. I need that quantum chip. But Aristotle, who was trying to systematize all knowledge. And he had these things that he didn't know where to put on his bookshelf. And he thought, well, the closest thing they are is kind of physics. So I'll put them next to physics, which is what metaphysics means. Next, so he put there the questions of philosophical conundra about what is the meaning of life? Where did we come from in a sense other than just plain blind biochemical evolution? Is there a purpose to it all? Do we survive in some sense? The questions that science theoretically should someday be able to answer. But as of yet, we have no good tools to tackle them. We can formulate the questions. We just can't find the answers yet. Those are the metaphysical questions.
How does a futurist identify trends to focus on? And I mean, I think what you do is great in your books, and you touched on it earlier, is you look at a trend and then you kind of do the ripple effect of how that impacts society and how we live and in the inventions and the behaviors or whatever that's born out of that. How do you identify trends as a futurist?
Yeah, the biggest problem with people who try to say, well, I don't know, who knows what the future is going to hold, is that they start from today in trying to predict it. So you have no vector, you have no direction to move ahead in. You don't know. You start from right now. Well, it's a pandemic. Well, it's a global economic collapse. Well, the Postal Service is in an uproar in the United States. You don't know what to extrapolate. You don't know what direction to go in. So the secret of being a futurist is first and foremost being a historian, is going back a decade, a century, whatever the time period is appropriate for the question. And, it doesn't take much thinking if you go back 100 years ago and then 50 and then 25, 10 and today to realize that our climate is getting warmer and extrapolate that trend to even worse global warming as time goes on. It doesn't take much to look at the myth it was, but still much more true than it is today, of the middle class. In the 1950s, the dream, the post-World War II dream, that the middle class would be positioned that if you're already above it, that's fine. Nobody's going to pull you down. But if you weren't yet there, you would have a decent and fair shot at making it into it. Well, from the 50s to today, we've seen the systemic barriers that have kept all sorts of marginalized groups from ever having their shot of moving on up. If I can quote the theme song from the Jeffersons, that was the aspiration. Moving on up to the east side, to the deluxe apartment in the sky, right? The notion that anybody could do that, we've seen derailed decade by decade. So it took no genius 10 years ago. If in 2010 you'd asked me what's going to be one of the defining things in 2020, I would have said income disparity. I would have said an enormous backlash against capitalism. And I would have said ultimately a worldwide economic collapse. I might not have pinned it correctly on an epidemic, but I would have recognized, as any number of futurists did, that everything was trending towards a collapse, that the system was serving a smaller and smaller percentage of the population effectively. And once you reach a tipping point, and of course, Malcolm Gladwell, the great futurist, the tipping point is the title of one of his books. Once you reach the point of no return, it's going to tumble and fall into that new scenario. And in terms of there being too much disparity between the rich and the poor in the West, we had passed that point in this last decade. And it was inevitable that we would see mass protests, all of the things we're seeing right now.
Wow, that's incredible. As a futurist again, and as a sci-fi person, knowing kind of, and a historian, and how things are today, where would you want to live? If you have, at what point in time would you want to be alive in the past, century or so? Would it be today where things are theoretically better, but also tipping into chaos? Or is there another time that you think was probably the best time, most balanced time to be alive?
It's a very interesting question. I was born in 1960, which a lot of pundits would say is the final year of the post-World War II baby boom, 15 years after the end of the war. I think if I had been born 15 years earlier, then that mean I would be 75 now. I wouldn't be happy about being 75 instead of only 60. But I think that there is a lot of truth that the 1980s was a really prosperous time. A lot of the drudgery of human life ended with the first wave of automation, of word processors and computers and the online life coming to us in the 1980s. We still had an economy that was, doing record well. We had an environment that we were still on the good side of the tipping point for. We might still be able to keep from tumbling into worldwide catastrophe. And the world was more or less at peace. So I think that, in fact, of the 20th century, nobody wants, you say, oh, great bucolic times early in the 20th century. Yeah, well, you didn't have a flush toilet if you were the average Joe. You didn't have electricity, meaning you didn't have light except burning things that might set your whole house on fire, right? The earliest anybody, I would say, was reasonably comfortable was the 1950s. With the one of the things that changed the world was antibiotics, which came in the 50s, right? That the childhood illnesses that ravaged so many families in the first half of the century suddenly became insignificances in the second half of the century. But it really, I think, around about 1980 was probably the best decade of the last 100 years.
Yeah, that's when I graduated high school and went to college and was in a fraternity in Indiana University. And I think, socially, I think a lot of us. Before talking to you, I just got off a Zoom conference with one of my brothers I hadn't from the fraternity that I hadn't seen for a while. He's a photographer, and he was a travel photographer for 10 years. He had a great career. He would go to places like Lithuania or Spain, and he would take you to places where you'd be with the locals, and he would show you, give you tips on photography. So, it was so you could really get the best pictures possible. It was a win-win, travel and go to a great place. And it's funny, just talking to him, and he's like, now it's like a lot of people we know are doing well at this time, but it's kind of hard for other people to reinvent themselves. And a lot of us are looking back to the 1980s, which didn't seem so spectacular at the time, but really were
No, you never appreciate it when you've got it. But take almost any job. In 1980, if you started off, let's say, to be a university professor, you would get tenure, you would get a secure job, and you would have a career. Now, everybody is a sessional instructor working starvation wages. I have friends who are young academics who have no hope ever of having a secure appointment. We had jobs, we had careers. You didn't have to worry about, everything falling apart upon you. And nothing was precarious the way it is today, I think. And I have a nostalgia for it. A lot of people have nostalgia for other decades, but it's hard to have nostalgia, say, for the 1960s with the Vietnam War and all of the racial unrest and assassinations and so forth. It's really hard to have a nostalgia for the 1940s with World War II. It's hard to have nostalgia for the Great Depression of the 1930s. But the 1980s, you can look at and say, as decades went, it was a pretty congenial one.
Yeah, and I was born in 1962, and I wasn't really cognizant I was cognizant of the moon landing, but I wasn't really aware of Woodstock. But I'd take a summer of love over the summer that we have right now, quite frankly.
Absolutely right. 1968, there was a real feeling in the world that a lot of the foolishness that had led to two previous world wars we talk about 68, the lifetime of the parents of the people who were enjoying the summer of love in 1968, that twice, and it's, the opening words of the United Nations Charter, to save the world from the scourge of war that twice in our lifetime has brought the world to ruin. I mean, we had thought we'd move beyond that love really, was the age of Aquarius, and that love really was going to be the way. And then it turned out, there's still, you got to make a living somehow, and a lot of that fell by the wayside. But it was a good time too, for sure. A noble dream,
Yeah, I mean, looking back, when I was a kid, I thought it was silly. I'm out in the 1980s liking Kiss, and bands like that. So it's just a different type of,
And the fashions, when no decade stands scrutiny for its music or for its fashions. when you look at it from more than 20 years on. But that's going to be true of us too. People are going to look at what we're wearing today, and we all think we look smart and professional, and that the death of the standard professional clothes with a tie for men and a skirt for women in the workplace, and we now have casual clothes. Everybody will look at that and laugh at us in 20 years, just as we laugh at the fashions of 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's inevitable. That's a trend you can bank on. That's me being a futurist right now. In 2040, they'll laugh at the 2020s.
There you go. Because I will tell you, my work wardrobe has changed. It was casual before, but now it's like shorts and a T-shirt every day because my bottom half isn't seen when I'm on all these Zoom conferences and stuff. And I'm on calls all day. It's crazy. Hey, everybody. This is your paranormal podcast pal, Bob Heskey. You know, every night I like to listen to videos on YouTube. But lately, with COVID, civil unrest, market volatility, politics, conspiracy theories, I just want to tune out. That's why I like Audible. What's Audible, you say? Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audio books, including some great horror and paranormal titles like A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, If It Bleeds by Stephen King, and The Boatman's Daughter by Andy Davidson.
This place is cursed.
Each month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, access to daily news digests if you actually want to hear the news, as well as guided meditation programs. Hey, we all need a little Zen now and again. And Audible is oh so easy. You can download titles and listen offline, anytime, anywhere, on any device. The app is free and can be installed in your smartphone or tablet. You can even listen across devices without losing your spot. How cool is that? If you can't decide what to listen to, no problem. You can keep your credits for up to a year and binge on your favorite series later on. So, here's the rub. The Afraid of Nothing podcast is stoked to partner with the audio bookworms at Audible to offer you a free 30-day trial membership. Just follow the link in the show notes, audibletrial.com/AON podcast.
Puedes repetir eso, por favor.
That's audibletrial.com/AON, all caps, podcast, lowercase. Full disclosure, I get a commission for everyone who signs up using that URL. But you get to try it for 30 days without a commitment. Using our custom URL doesn't cost you a penny and helps out the show if you do sign up. Nothing scary about that. So escape reality and pick up a book, an audio book, and listen to what's out there. Go to audibletrial.com/AON podcast after listening to the show. You had mentioned that a futurist is part historian. I've talked to other people in the paranormal world, and they say something interesting as well. They say ghost hunting is history as well. It's not just the paranormal, but it's history, and there's a story. And I know authors that have gone to places with the paranormal to try to explore mysteries of the past and kind of try to solve them. I bring that up for 2 reasons. One, I want to ask you, have you ever had a paranormal experience ever in your life, seen a UFO or thought you felt a ghost or anything? Or anybody in your family ever had an experience like that?
So when I was about, this is roughly the right age, I'm going to say, about 11 or 12, my best friend at the time, David, and I decided we would sleep out in my parents' backyard. And I live in Toronto, but the summers in Toronto are lovely. We get 80-degree temperatures and 90-degree temperatures and very, very pleasant. So we're sleeping on our sleeping bags on the grass in the backyard of my parents. And, you know, I was a space buff, and we were watching, and there is a light moving across the sky, north to south, very slowly. And I said to my friend here, I'm a know-it-all. I said, you know what that is? That's a satellite in polar orbit. It'll take about 90 minutes to orbit the Earth. The polar orbits we usually use about 90 minutes. We watched it for a little while, and I was very smugly satisfied that that's what it was. And then it reversed direction. And then it started going backwards. And my friend and I were gobsmacked because he believed me. And, he wasn't as much of a space buff. But I had a perfectly rational explanation for what we were seeing until It did exactly the opposite of what any satellite can do, which is change direction and went the other way. And we watched it until it disappeared over the horizon, the same horizon it had risen over. And no airplane behaves that way. No airplane takes 40 or 50 minutes to transverse the sky, right? I have no idea. To this day, I have no idea what it was.
Yeah.
And you said about stories, by the way. I went to New Orleans not that long ago and took one of their ghost tours.
Yep.
Where they'll take you after dark and a local, you used the exact right word, a local historian will walk you around and tell you the story behind every one of the supposedly haunted houses or mansions or abattoirs or whatever it is you're passing by. There's always a story. There's always a tale to be told. And they're always endlessly fascinating, for sure.
Yeah, history is really embedded in everything. Whether it's futurist, because you're looking at cycles and trends, or even ghost hunting.
And, talking about ghosts, our history, the most interesting history, I mentioned the civil unrest of the 1960s. What was I talking about? Well, the assassination of Martin Luther King, among others. Also, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. Our history is driven by people prematurely and unnaturally meeting their deaths. It is all of our turning points in history, whether it's World War I starting, right, because of the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. No matter where you look, there is somebody whose life ended inappropriately soon through nefarious means. And it's no wonder that we're fascinated by what happened to the spirit of that person. It's a natural question, because these aren't people like my parents who drifted away in old age and died worn out when there was not much left. These are people who exited our normal life in the full vim and vigor of youth. What happened to them? It's an interesting and provocative question, for sure.
Yeah, and it certainly changes the course of history, because they would have changed the course of history if they were around.
That's right. Whether they lived or whether they died, it's when you talk about those quantum physics, where the world line diverts in a way. If Martin Luther King hadn't been assassinated in 1968, if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, any number of these things, who knows? If World War I had not occurred, who knows, right, what our world would look like today.
Yeah, and Martin Luther King or JFK, if they lived longer, later in life, would they have done something that took away from their earlier iconic status? So maybe when they left, is that for some reason the impact that society needed to remember them as? It's interesting.
This is so true. Isn't it true? We look at somebody like, this is 19 years after September 11th. 19 years ago, Rudy Giuliani was America's mayor,
right?
Was lauded on the world stage, was a hero to everybody, regardless of their political affiliation. And now he is this figure of ridicule, right? It's absolutely true that certainly a lot of people outlive their glory time and stay in the public spotlight way beyond when they should. If we all live long enough, one of the reasons I think you're exactly right that we don't live forever is in an infinite amount of time, you're bound to screw up big time at some point. And everything you did beforehand will cease to matter.
Yeah, it's better to leave the party before you're a drunken fool that walks through a glass door.
100%. 100%.
I want to ask you, what's your favorite sci-fi book or film? Is there something you've watched that's really, even if you're embarrassed by it, but what's a really great sci-fi movie and a book that you'd recommend that isn't yours?
So the book is one by a man named Frederick. He has no C in it, so it's Frederick with just an IK at the end. Pohl, German name, P-O-H-L, Frederick Pohl, and it's called Gateway. And I think it's the finest science fiction novel ever written. It came out in 1976, and it is a story of a man racked by guilt, undergoing psychotherapy sessions at the hands of an artificial intelligence, an AI shrink who goes by the name Siegfried von Shrink. And what he's guilty for, I won't spoil the book, except that it all hinges on astrophysics. It is the most perfect example of blending the intimately human, a man racked by horrible, horrible guilt for something he did to other people, and the grandly cosmic, the great mysteries of astrophysics in one narrative. And I recommend it highly. It won the Hugo and the Nebula, the top 2 awards in the science fiction field, which I've won as well, but for 2 different books. Wow. This is one book that managed to win them both. Yeah. Gateway, Frederick Pohl. As for the movies, I go back and forth, but I'm going to say 2001: A Space Odyssey. The other one I often cite came out the same year, the original Planet of the Apes. But 2001, we talked about metaphysics. 2001 absolutely is about where did we come from? It starts with the dawn of man. It posits that we would have just probably gone extinct, just another species of ape that died out, if it hadn't been for the intervention of advanced extraterrestrials. That's what the monolith is in that film, that comes to Africa 4 million years ago and teaches us how to make tools. It's a film about a journey that ends in a rebirth. It's an incredibly metaphysical, spiritual film, but also the most rigorous, serious attempt to at least extrapolate science and technology into the future. Now, what's the glaring omission is that both Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick, who wrote the screenplay together and Stanley Kubrick, who directed and produced the film, was that they saw no social advancement. There's no sense that women will have any significant role in the 21st century, except for a Russian woman, and Russian women already had, were holding down, quote unquote, men's jobs in the 1960s when that movie was made. Not a single person of color in the entire film. It was utterly oblivious to what was going on in the real world, the women's lib movement and the Black Power movement and the racial reckoning the United States was dealing with. But in terms of extrapolating science and technology, talking computers, artificial intelligence, space tourism, all the things that we ultimately did get, maybe a decade or 2 later than they thought we would get them. But they accurately predicted so much in that film.
Yeah, it's one of those movies I probably haven't watched it as much as I should have. It seems like one of those films you have to watch several times to at least someone who's a little less brilliant like myself to come away with some of the hidden treasures in it. I wanted to ask you, your science fiction is a crossover between mysteries sometimes, which is great. I think some of your coolest premises. Do you mind telling us I know it's nothing about paranormal, but it is really cool about how you've kind of interwoven science fiction with mystery in some of your books. Do you mind just telling our audience some of your favorites, like 2 or 3 of the books that kind of are almost sci-fi mystery and what the log line is to them?
Oh, sure. The most obvious one is A Legal Alien, which is a courtroom drama with an extraterrestrial defendant.
That's awesome.
I also have one called Red Planet Blues, which is a hard-boiled detective novel set on Mars. There are various other ones, but those are the 2 highest concept, single logline mystery science fiction novels I've done. And, mystery and science fiction actually have a great deal in common. They're both about the rational thought process, right? What does a detective do? A detective goes and tries to pick up little bits of information, we call them clues, piece together whatever the heck actually happened, we call it the crime, and identify the culprit. What happens in a science fiction novel? Well, the reader is playing detective there, piecing together from the little clues that are in the text what the whole universe is like. The novelist doesn't stop and give you 8 pages describing how the political structure works. It just says, as they did, for instance, in 1984, there's no off switch on the TV. That's all you need to know about, the TV in 1984 is you can't shut it off. It's going to beam its messages into your house and your head all the time. You pick up that little clue, it tells you an enormous amount about how that world works.
Did you know how those books were going to end when you started writing them, or did it kind of evolve?
They both evolved, I have to say, which is contrary to the advice I give my writing students. And any good mystery writer will tell you, you have to know who did it first. It's a hell of a lot more work to figure out halfway through, oh, now I get it. But for me, kind of noodling around on the page was my way of working out what the mystery was going to be. And this whole secret is, of course, you go back and you do revisions so that when somebody reads the book and they get to the end, they go, oh, wow, everything went snick, 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 snick. It was all perfectly worked out. Well, it was, because you read the 8th draft. I had to struggle through the 7 you didn't read to get to that point. That's the magic.
That's the magic of it. So I have one more futurist question, then I'm going to close by asking you about your latest book again and when it's coming out and where they can get your stuff. So my last question on futurism is there any 2 or 3 things you see about society in terms of where we are now and the dramatic kind of disruption we've had a few months ago? Like, for example, people leaving the cities or people being used to working from home and not being social with people outside, and maybe even the negative side of people becoming more depressed and suicidal because they're not having that human contact that they subconsciously need.
Yes. Now, you're absolutely right, and I don't minimize for one moment how difficult this has been on an awful lot of people. Absolutely, I have friends who have been suicidal during this period, and I'm sure most people can relate to knowing people for whom this has been very, very difficult. That said, our old world order, pre-COVID, was very, very difficult for an awful lot of people, too. Introverts, those who don't like to play power politics at work, those who aren't climbers, those who aren't glib and outspoken, those who aren't wanting all the time to have to lean in and fight for their place at the table, found our old work paradigm very, very stressful. And also were often depressed and sometimes suicidal. So what we're seeing is not a collapse of work, but we're seeing the age of work being built around the extroverted personality coming to an end, and work built around the introverted personality coming to the fore. And I suspect what ultimately everything is driven by economics, what the powers that be will figure out is that the introvert who doesn't spend 90 minutes to 2 hours out of every day socializing when they're supposed to be working is actually much more productive. That a job system and an economy based on people who sit down, work alone, uninterrupted, undisturbed, not multitasking between this meeting and that person calling and somebody else wanting to talk over the fabric divider between their cubicle and your cubicle, but simply getting down and concentrating on their work is actually much more productive. It's going to be the day of the introvert coming ahead. The other thing is, you mentioned the city is dead. The only reason for cities was because we needed to be able to go to work and live close to where we worked. So you had people come together in these big Toronto, 3.5 million people, other cities much bigger, cesspools they are the breeding grounds of disease. They are our hot spots. And people are realizing, you don't have to be crowded in. You don't have to have that miserable commute every day. You don't have to live anywhere near where the person who is generating your paycheck is. You can work from your home. I think we're going to see a real dispersal. And for a country like Canada, we're bigger physically than the United States, and we're 1/10 of your population. We're bigger physically than China. We're 5% of China's population. We're going to see people dispersing all over the place. The world will be a much more evenly populated area instead of these hotspots in the years to come.
So do you see people leaving the U.S. going to like Canada or other places that are less populated?
Without putting too fine a point on it, it all depends what happens the first week of November with your elections. Yeah. People will make up their minds on how that election turns out, or whether or not they're happy with the direction the United States will either continue to go or start to take at that point. But even in the United States, there are huge parts of the United States that are sparsely populated. Whereas a little island, Manhattan, is, one of the most densely populated places in the world. There's no necessity for that anymore. My little industry of publishing, it turns out, to the surprise of publishers who ridiculously have had all their offices have been in Manhattan, the most expensive rental real estate in the Western world, have found that, Their employees are just as productive working from home. We don't actually need to have an office at, say, 175 Fifth Avenue, which is where my publisher is, right? The Flatiron Building, one of the most expensive buildings to rent in the United States, and it's just not necessary. So we'll see people working in small towns, out in the countryside, in little villages, and be happier and healthier for it.
And I kind of lied to you. I have one other question, which is about education, because I have 2 kids, and I'm really curious, and they're probably 4 or 5 years away from college. How do you see education? Because, look, our education system has certainly been flawed, I think. Do you see dramatic changes in our education system going forward?
Absolutely. Our standard system is really still identical to that one-room schoolhouse of pioneer days. One person, back then it was usually a single woman, at the front of a room lecturing people from the one copy of the book that they had. They even still call it in England. They'll say somebody is reading this topic, meaning they had to go to a university because only the university would have the book on that topic. Now that we live in an information age where the entire sum total of human knowledge is available to everyone, everywhere, all the time for free, this notion that we're going to cram 30, 40, 50 people into a high school classroom or 100 to 1,000 people into an undergraduate lecture hall to listen to one guy who may not even be very good at his topic, motor mouth on at the front of the room, it's over. It's over. Distance learning and learning from the best. The companies that are prospering right now are companies like the Teaching Company and Masterclass and so forth, who are saying the great courses, companies like that. Audible, which brings you all kinds of nonfiction books. Why learn from some guy at, your junior college who isn't very good and very motivated when you can learn astrophysics from Neil deGrasse Tyson? The world of the classroom and the teacher is just, it's over.
So my kids are going to be much more smarter than me, but hopefully I won't have to pay for a college education. That's my takeaway from that.
Well, it's really true. The college education is outrageously expensive. It clearly is a model that doesn't work, especially in the United States. All the major universities here in Canada where I live, are public institutions. And so the tuition, if you're a resident, is quite reasonably modest. You don't graduate with 20 years of debt in front of you. But if you want a first-rate private school, private university education in the United States, it is out of reach, except for either great geniuses who get full scholarships or the very rich. Absolutely, that paradigm has to crumble. It's ridiculous that the whole world is there on the internet for free, and you're paying $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 a year to go to USC, University of Southern California. Makes no sense at all.
Wow. Well, that's a good place to end. But what I do want to end is I want to go back to where we started, which is your book. Your first book, The Oppenheimer Alternative. So give us another tease about that, where they can get it, and also where they can find your books on Audible and your website.
Sure. My 24th novel just out, The Oppenheimer Alternative, an alternate history about the Manhattan Project. If it's not in your local store, of course, they can order it for you, or it's on any of your online booksellers. There's an audiobook version, and it's available from Audible or iTunes, wherever you get your audiobooks. And, of course, it's available in all ebook formats as well. My website, I am a science fiction writer, so it's sfwriter.com. S is in science, F is in fiction, writer.com.
Thank you so much, Robert. I wish you much success. I'll be checking out some of your books, and thank you for sharing your insights.
My pleasure, Bob. Be well.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee. and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.